Hello, this is Kaii Marie, and you are listening to episode 7, season 1 of the Healing Element podcast. If you are watching this episode on the Healing Element podcast YouTube channel, please be sure to like and subscribe. If you are listening by audio, please be sure to download today's episode and subscribe as well. Today's topic is, can you inherit trauma? Research says yes. Hello and welcome to the Healing Element Podcast, a weekly discussion giving you the tools to understand and heal from intergenerational trauma. I am your host, Kaii Marie. To find out more information about the topics discussed today, visit kaimarie.com. Hello and welcome to the Healing Element Podcast. I am your host, Kaii Marie, and I am joined here with my guest, Brandon Jones. Very excited to have him here. This is his first time on the podcast now that we've officially launched. So excited to have him as a guest. The first time that he was on the podcast is when I did a live Facebook discussion. And so you can go to my Facebook page, Kaii Marie _ the Healing Element, for that information. So today we're going to be talking about, of course, trauma. We're going to be talking about, can you inherit trauma? And research says yes. So before we jump into the topic, I just want to provide Brandon's bio. Brandon is a psychotherapist, professor, consultant. He specializes in adverse childhood experiences, ACEs, historical and intergenerational trauma, social and emotional intelligence, EQ, leadership and youth justice. Born and raised in St. Paul, Minnesota, Brandon has survived living in a home of domestic violence and various other forms of trauma. Brandon holds a BA in psychology from the University of Minnesota, a master's in community psychology from Metropolitan State University, and a master's in psychotherapy, MFT, from Adler Graduate School. Brandon is also a 2013 Bush Foundation Leadership Fellow. He is also a professor at the Metropolitan State University, Inverhills College, and Century College. He lives by the motto, live life with purpose on purpose. Brandon, welcome to the Healing Element Podcast.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me again. It is a pleasure. And yes, I am a unicorn, a black male therapist. We barely exist. I have 13 jobs, but all my jobs are centered around helping people move forward in life. And that's my passion.
Awesome. And so great to have you here. We've had discussions offline and learning so much from your background and your experiences. So I'm looking forward to today's conversation.
Absolutely.
So as I said, today's topic is, can trauma be basically passed down to a next generation? And according to research, it says yes. So before we kind of answer that question, why do we first get an understanding of how do we define trauma?
Yeah, so trauma has a lot of different definitions. Academics, there are a lot of academics that have written big, thick books, 350-page books on what trauma is. The way that I define it and the way that I articulate it to the people that I work with is trauma is a deep emotional wound. And I came up with that definition because what I noticed is that for a lot of people that I work with, especially African-American folks, trauma is not always what is seen in a textbook for the folks that I work with. I have folks that, a typical day for them will be, okay, I didn't have enough money to pay my bills, so I worked out an agreement to pay, a little bit down and had to pay the rest later. Then I got on a bus to go talk to these people, and then while I was at the bus stop, I seen a fight break out. It wasn't anything big, but somebody got their head busted. I thought it was funny. I got on the bus and I went on my way. To me, that's a traumatic experience. For them, it's just a everyday experience to see somebody get their head cracked and then they moving on. And when I've talked to clients who've had similar experiences like that, I'm like, why aren't they responding in a traumatic manner to see someone go through a violent experience and end up in a situation that can lead them to a hospital? Well, they're exposed to violence so frequently and so often that it's a normal everyday experience. So what I started to think about is, how do I define trauma? Because that is traumatic. It does have an impact on their subconscious and their conscious mindset. But what ends up happening for them is, since they see it so often, it's nothing. And so what I noticed was, trauma for people is really what connects with them emotionally, and it's that a deep emotional wound. And I've had so many clients that have been sexually abused, or they've been in domestic violence situations, they've been in foster care, they've had abandonment issues, they've been bullied, all these things that are very horrific, but they don't take it as such a huge thing to them. It's just like, well, that was just how my life was.
Right.
So I had to boil down my definition to a deep emotional wound.
I think
Yeah.
that's excellent because of those different experiences, especially as you said, dealing with the African American community, that a lot of what we think is just normal, doing air quotes,
Right.
is actually traumatic. And I think that ties in to my next question is, because sometimes that's seen as normal because it's what has happened in someone's family, that's what's
Right.
happening to their extended family, so their immediate extended, and then in their community is probably what they're seeing on television. So
Yep.
then trauma becomes normalized.
Yep.
And so how then do you show, when you're talking to African American community, or just with the community that is that you're helping them work through traumas that they've experienced, how do you show them, okay, this is an example of how trauma shows up in your life when it hasn't been resolved?
Absolutely. So I start to ask a series of questions. I'm big on cognitive behavioral therapy, also known as CBT. And when I start to ask questions on how have those experiences impacted your life, first, if you just ask that question, people will say, it's nothing, it's whatever, I took it and I kept moving forward. But then when you start doing different techniques, like one CBT technique is called downward arrow. And what that does is just ask a series of questions for you to kind of boil down what your core belief is, or your core understanding of a situation is. When I start to do that, then they start to realize, like, holy crap, like this has really impacted my life. Like my mom cussing me out and telling me I ain't nothing, or I'm just a black nobody, or you act just like your daddy, and all that type of stuff starts to impact the mentality and the behaviors and the thought process of the individual. So when you do things like that, that's when you make the connection. So I usually ask people, like, I'll ask them a question like, how has that worked out for you? Right. And what that does is it puts the onus back on the actual client or the person you're working with to process emotionally and mentally how their experiences have impacted them. Many times people have not taken the time to analyze and think about how their experiences have connected back to them, because they're just living life and moving forward. And, they're hitting checkpoint after checkpoint, and they're just, pushing through. Unfortunately, especially in the Black community, one thing that we have done is we have accepted trauma as a norm. I mean, we have literally called our culture, as African American culture, the struggle. So if you can't struggle, if you can't deal with the struggle, if you can't be an independent, strong Black woman, if you can't be a Black man that can deal with the pain, then you ain't Black. like literally, that's almost an understanding that we have. But at the same time, that still has an emotional toll on us as a people, and that's not right. And it's not to say that we need to act like other types of people, and it's not to say that we're not resilient. But what it is to say is, pain does not have to be a part of our existence. It is that adversity makes us stronger, but at the same time, it doesn't have to exist. But we're so used to getting the short end of the stick. We're so used to dealing with pain and trauma and adversity that it has become just kind of like a normalized thing for us to keep pushing forward and dealing with, and it doesn't have to be. So what I try to help my clients and the people that I work with understand is, the trauma doesn't have to be there. You can have a life of abundance. You can have a life of thriving and moving forward and evolving. It does not have to be about any type of adversity. Dealing with adversity is important because it does build character, but it shouldn't be the thing that makes you who you are. And unfortunately, so many Black people have dealt with so much, pain, that that's how we have defined ourselves. So what I try to help us do is understand that pain is a part of our existence, but it's not the end of who we are. I've dealt with pain myself. I've dealt with a lot of domestic violence, like you talked about in my bio. I've dealt with all types of racism. I have been privileged and disfortunate at the same time to be the only Black face in a lot of different situations. And I have to represent all Black people in many different situations.
Right.
And at the same time, I have to show that Black people are intelligent, that we don't have to take any of your crap, and that we do belong at this particular type of table. And when I do that, I'm representing everybody. Even if I don't want to, it doesn't matter.
Right.
I am.
Right.
And many Black people have to do those situations, especially in professional settings. And what's important for us to do is not lose ourselves in those situations.
Right. That's so true. And because when you arrive to that situation, right, where you're the only Black person in a particular setting, there's a whole history behind that.
Absolutely.
So you're picking up into that as well. It's just not the racism that you experience directly, but from your lineage. So that goes right into kind of how that trauma is passed down. And going back to the point that you had made about what you noticed when you were working in our community, the fact that you have people that, like for someone, would you say that someone saw someone's like head, for example, like got in a fight or something like that. It's like, oh, someone got in a fight, I hopped on the bus. And it's because there, as you said, there's been this culture of this is just how our community works. But that's also because there's been a history of experiences in this country that have now created a situation where this is our norm.
Right.
And so for these families, not moving a little bit from the historical part, but more to the personal with looking at the families. So when we look at trauma, we talked about how a person experiences that directly, but then there's also ties into how trauma can be transferred from one generation to the next. Right. And so there have been studies about that in preparation for our interview today. Looked at a couple different studies that I found kind of interesting before we hop into the science, the epigenetics, which I find so fascinating.
It is very fascinating. Yes.
Yeah, very interesting. So I wanted to know if you could talk a little bit about the study that was done. I believe this was by a professor at Mount Sinai, where she did a study about Holocaust survivors. Yeah. And she was able to use that to make an argument about how trauma is transferred from one generation to the next. Yep. I have to plug in here for Dr. DeGroo's work, post-traumatic slave syndrome. So we are going to delve into that in future episodes, but I just wanted to, I can't have this conversation without mentioning that. Absolutely. Very important work of Dr. Joy DeGroo. Yep. But going to the work of, that was done by the professor at Mount Sinai, of the study that she did within the Jewish community. Can you talk a little bit about that and what her findings told us about generational trauma? Yes.
I can't remember the doctor's name off the top of my head, but that's okay. So what her research did was it looked at not the next generation after the Holocaust, but the generation after that. So we're talking about the grandchildren of the original people who experienced the Holocaust. And what they found was the stress hormones matched the same levels of the people who experienced the Holocaust as their grandchildren. So what they were able to do was connect that stress hormone levels can be passed down from not just one generation, but two generations. And what the thought process is around that is the stress hormones can be passed down to multiple generations, even beyond that. The way that they were able to validate this study was looking at 9/11 survivors who were pregnant during the time, stress hormone levels from the time that they were pregnant to the time that they gave birth, and their children years later, and their levels of stress hormones. So this has been a very common epigenetic study of how stress hormones are passed on from mothers in utero on to the next generation. So we're able to validate this study. And this is very commonly known in the world of neurobiology, in the world of biology just in general, is how mothers can pass their stress from one generation to the next. There was a study that came out in 2016 that talked about how fathers can pass down the stress hormones from their semen from conception into the mom and into the baby that they conceive, and how they can pass their own stress hormones, which blew my mind because, one, I'm thinking, well, how did they actually figure this out? Like, how do you do that type of study? Like, that is a weird study. But then two, if that is true, that explains a lot. Because when you look at Black people and Black folks and Native American folks, the amount of stress that both of those ethnic groups have experienced, and if men can pass their stress hormones onto the mother and onto the fetus before it's even conceptualized into a child, this is before the child even has a sex to be identified, that is huge. And if that's true, we know that there's huge ramifications of it. But there's a flip side to that coin. So that's just the genetic factors. There's also a social factor that takes place in this whole epigenetic function. And that's what Dr. Joy DeGruy talks about, and also myself, is what are those behavioral and habitual type of things that take place to responding to trauma, systematic racism, white supremacy, etc., that take place. One of the things that kind of gets referenced when we talk about these behavioral patterns that are passed down is this old adage of you have 3 generations of women who are cooking a holiday ham. What is it? Holiday? It could be Thanksgiving, Christmas, whatever, right? And they talk about how this ham is prepared. So the adage is, you have the 3rd generation, you have a young woman who says, "Mom, why do you cut the ham in half and bake it?" And the mom says, "Hey, go talk to your grandmother because I learned how to cook this ham from your grandmother." So then the young girl goes to the grandmother and says, "Hey, grandma, why do you cut this ham the way that you cut it in order to bake it for the family?" And the grandmother says, "Well, that's how my grandmother told me how to do it. Go talk to your great grandmother who's still alive." So then she goes and talks to the great grandmother. She says, "Hey, great grandma, why do you cook this ham like this?" And she says, "Well, baby, back in my day when we cooked hams, the oven wasn't as big. So I had to cut the ham in half in order to bake the ham." So it wasn't anything like spectacular. It was just what they were given at the time in order to bake the ham. So great grandma taught grandma how to cook it that way. Grandma taught mom how to cook it that way. And mom has taught the younger daughter how to cook it that way because of the given situation. If you use that kind of allegory or story and think about how Black people have gotten to where we have gotten today, why do we do the things that we do? Because great grandma did it that way, grandma did it that way, mama did it that way, and now we do it the same way that we were taught. The way we discipline our children, the way that we talk to our children about being careful and suspicious of other people, the way we name our children, the foods that we eat, the schools how we learn, who we decide to mate with and who we don't decide to mate with. All this comes from somewhere, and all that is a response to the trauma that we have dealt with and that we have experienced as a people. Even on the racism and white supremacy is very different than what our great grandparents have dealt with, is still a issue. And this is why and how we got to the place that we are today. Our entire culture as Black people has been a response to racism, white supremacy, as it is in the form that it is today. So when we look at Black culture and we wonder why are we the way that we are, it's because we've been consistently responding to the system that it is today.
Right. That's so true. And the thing is, which when I do talk to members of my community and they say, well, we just need to get over it.
Yeah.
That's not how it works.
No.
And when someone is in pain or experiencing trauma, that's the last thing you want to tell them to do is just get over it. Right. You have to come in a position where you're like, okay, this is where we are. How did we get here? So to do that, you have to start taking a step back. And you can't just kind of look at where we are now without paying attention to everything that occurred, Jim Crow,
right.
Mass incarceration. I'm hopping around with the timeline, but these are traumatic events that happened to us, which has produced what you currently see in our families and in our community. And this actually reminds me of this study that was done with the mice. Now, for people that love animals, I'm sorry, you may want to plug your ears for this.
White lab rats.
So it was a study in which I guess this doctor, he was doing work in a community, poor community. He saw that there was a lot of drug addiction, and he saw that how the parents were living, how that was then affecting the kids. Right. So he wanted to kind of do a study and see the correlation, exactly what was happening. So he used mice. So, I mean, if you love animals, wouldn't you rather him use some rats than human beings to use as test subjects?
Right.
But anyway, so he had the mice, and I believe it was the male mice that he put in a container, allowed them to smell like a cherry type of scent. And anytime, and he would shock them while they were in this enclosed container.
Right.
And so basically, they developed were a fear of this scent, and
Right.
that was then passed on to the other mice that they had.
Right.
What's interesting is it also showed up in the third generation of mice, so like the
Right. The same
grandchildren.
fear.
Yeah, and so it's interesting that anytime, so these looking at the grandpups, I guess you could say, when they would smell this scent, they would have the same reaction as, let's say, the grandfather.
Right.
So when you were talking about those experiences and also how you show up in spaces where you are the only Black person, you're coming with all of everything that your past generation experienced. You're showing up in that moment with all of
Right.
that within you, all of that within your DNA.
Absolutely. And you're showing up with the resiliency and things that have helped you move forward, helped your people move forward as well, which we call that ancestral wisdom. So you're showing up with both the fears, the anxieties, and also that ability to push through and keep moving forward. It's a very real thing. And that study is a modified version of B.F. Skinner's Skinner box experiment. One thing that's important for us to understand about that, and this gets into this general psychology, is that we can't overlook the environment that those mice were put in.
Right.
And we can't overlook that those mice were a part of a system where the researcher was the dictator of the outcomes. And Black folks, when it comes to that general psychology, that 101, I actually make this point in my class, is don't overlook the researcher. Because we have been the mice for a long time, unfortunately. Even though we've made strides, we've moved forward, we've been in this experiment. It's one of the reasons why they call the projects a project. Like we have been a part of this. Let's see what happens if we do X, Y, and Z. How will people's behaviors change? What will they do? This is how we've gotten to where we are today. It hasn't just been an overnight thing where we see mass dysfunctional behaviors from Black folks. And I'm not saying that every Black person is dysfunctional, but if we look at our community overall, we have a lot of work to do. We have been surviving. We have not been thriving as a people collectively. And it's very important for us to understand that if we're going to move forward as an ethnic group, we have to change our mentality and our behaviors as best as we can because things are changing. Right now, we're going through a pandemic. And I'm going to be completely honest and very vulnerable at this moment. I'm very scared to see how Black folks are going to come out at the other end of this pandemic. I see Black folks not taking COVID-19 serious at all. Barbecues, hanging out. You know, locally where I'm at, we had 5 shootings over the weekend, all in Black communities. And it's like, why are we even outside doing the things that we're doing? Whether we believe COVID-19 is a real thing or not, we should be still taking the precautions that we need to take to protect ourselves. But it's just business as usual. We have to continue to move forward as best as we can and thrive. Because at the end of the day, when Black folks are a part of things, we always make stuff better. But when it comes to just us, we can make things worse because we don't have that ability to trust one another. We look at each other very suspiciously, and we also tend to not trust that we can do anything better than we can do. And that's what I try to do is help us see ourselves in a different light as best as possible. And we have to keep moving forward. But but that's our conditioning. That's how we are and who we've been. And we've been conditioned to kind of be this lowest rung on the social ladder, as we move forward, is to always be there. And when one of us or some of us move forward, we kind of look at them with a side eye and treat them different. I wish it wasn't that way, but that's where we are from a mental and psychological standpoint.
Right. And to your point, when you were saying as far as the pandemic that we're in right now, our community really not taking this seriously. And when you start to look at COVID-19, I mean, the people that are most vulnerable, the people at least the reports that are coming out right now, that have underlying health conditions such as
Right.
diabetes, high blood pressure.
Yep.
And these are all health conditions that
Yep.
seriously impact our community.
When you break it down by ethnicity, Black folks are 1 and 2 on the list.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
And so when I see the numbers coming in, as far as the numbers of African Americans that are in the hospital with suffering from COVID-19, many of them have those type of underlying conditions. So it is extremely important that we take this seriously. And Brandon, do you think our reason, speaking as a community, for not really taking this seriously? I mean, we have all of in history as far as the experimentation that was done in the medical profession, kind of like the distrust there.
Yep.
And do you think any of that plays into our belief system as to why we're not taking it seriously? Does that have anything to do with it?
Absolutely. I think there's 2 things here. I think one, there's a lot of information coming at us at one time. Some information is accurate, some of it might not be as accurate, right? Early on, when all this stuff started to kick off, Black folks can get it because of our melanin, right? I don't know if you heard that, but I heard that. All right, so you heard it. You heard it where you at. I heard it where I'm at. So that means many Black folks heard it. Okay.
Yes.
So we can't get it because we melanated. On the continent of Africa, ain't nobody got COVID-19. Ain't nobody got the coronavirus, right? Now, is that true? I don't know, but I know some NBA players got it and they Black. So I'm just gonna leave it at that. Right. So we have a lot of information coming at us. We don't know what's true and what's not true. The second part of that is what you said. It is that mistrust of the medical system. And we have good reason to mistrust the medical system. It is taking children away from us. It has caused death in our families. It has caused people to be removed from our families, etc. So we don't know not just the medical system, let me back up, also the government. So we don't trust a lot of things the government says in general.
Right.
But what I would suggest is whether you believe coronavirus, COVID-19 is real or not, it's having an impact on your life no matter what. People are losing their jobs. People are losing housing. Your kids is at home with you right now. Okay.
Right.
You might not want your children at home, but they there. So it's a very real reality in our lives, and we have to respond in that way. So whether you believe it's real or not, it's still impacting your life, and you should be doing the best things that you can do to act accordingly to take care of yourself and your family. Whether that means wiping down things, wearing gloves and masks and all these, washing your hands and all those things or not, you should be still responding in a manner that is helping you move forward, because this is where we're at in society. Society has been shut down. Sports are on pause. Businesses are closing. People are losing jobs. Things are happening. Flights are delayed and canceled. We need to be responding because this is very real. Whether you believe the virus is real or not does not matter. The impact and the aftermath of this virus is very real. And as Black folks, we have to always remember, just like the old adage of where the last to get hired and first get fired, we will be the first to be hurt by this situation and the last people to benefit from it if we don't get our act together.
Right. It's so true. We have to take this seriously. And it's funny, I was at Walmart the other day and picking up some items, and I heard someone say, "Oh, we're going to be throwing a quarantine party."
Yeah, we gonna kick it in.
I hope that's on Zoom.
Nope, the liquor stores are still open.
But we have to take this seriously, because this is putting our healthcare system, is stretching our healthcare system, our hospitals.
Yeah.
Even when you start looking at what happens, as you talk about, like the economic impact that this is having, when people start, I don't hate to say this, but running out of money, so maybe running out of food. I know that there have been conversations as far as not allowing landlords to evict tenants, like working out some type of arrangement so that families can keep their home and not end up homeless. But you never know what happens when someone has to feed their child, when they have a hungry baby and they have no money. And when you look especially at what's going on in New York, where you have a lot of the police force, first responders, are getting hit with the COVID-19 in the hospital. So you have a reduced police force. I'm not saying this is going to happen, but we could end up in a situation where you have to protect yourself.
Absolutely.
And if you're busy you're busy being distracted by other things and not taking this seriously, you're not going to be prepared. And I guess this kind of leads to another question. When people experience trauma and just continue to experience traumatic experiences, and they maybe they don't even know they've been traumatized, so it's like, I don't have to heal from anything, I'm not being traumatized, or if they know that they have, they just don't know what to do.
Right.
So there could be a need to escape. Like, if I don't know how to do this, so I'm just going to escape through partying, through, you know, doing whatever, going out, constantly
Right.
being busy. And so we as a community have consistently experienced trauma, and our outlet is going out, leaving,
Right.
partying, doing other things. So what is this also doing to that psyche of like, no, you can't do that? And also, we're social people, not just looking at it from a negative lens, but we're very social people.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so now that we're in this space that we can't be social,
Can't be it. Yep.
that's also affecting us.
Mm-hmm.
And who knows what type of triggers are coming up that from that, not only that trauma we experience directly, but also from our lineage.
Absolutely. So yes, you're very right. We are social people. Social distancing. What is that when it comes to Black folks? We don't like what? I mean, I can't see my grandma. I gotta go see mama. I don't know what nobody else got to say. Papa and mama need to see me. I'm going to see them. All right. We having a barbecue. We going. Okay.
Right,
That's where
right.
we at. Right.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to sheltering in place, you trying to tell me I need to stay at my house? No, I need to go outside and get some fresh air. These
Mm-hmm.
kids driving me crazy. I need to go do my thing.
Right, right.
These are all things that are being placed upon us, but
Mm-hmm.
we have to do what we have, but we still internally feel like we need to do what we need to do culturally because it makes sense to us. So
Mm-hmm.
this is going to be a struggle no matter what.
Yeah.
You know, distant learning. What you trying to tell me the schools don't want to teach my kids and I got to still go to work because I'm
Mm-hmm.
essential staff? That's going to be very difficult for a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
I think that this is a moment of us coming together.
Mm-hmm.
I think that this is another thing that Black people have gone through. And
Mm-hmm.
since we've gone through so much and we persevered and moved forward, that we're just like, oh, this ain't the coronavirus. That ain't gonna stop us, you know. Just like the
Mm-hmm.
song Coronavirus, like it's getting real, like it's getting really real. Like it's just another thing that we've
Mm-hmm.
experienced. But guess what? We've always been able to persevere and move
Mm-hmm.
forward.
Right.
And I don't think we're taking it as serious as we should be. Now, again, when you have built a culture around responding to adversity, and
Mm-hmm.
you haven't built a culture around thriving through adversity, we
Mm-hmm.
will continue to get the short end of the stick of any situation that shows up to us. So
Mm-hmm.
my goal and what I try to do is help us thrive through it and move forward as best as possible. Because at the end of the day, you know, when people are getting laid off, you know, when the medical system's getting overrun and now
Mm-hmm.
your insurance ain't good enough to get the quality care that you need or whatever situation is, now we're
Mm-hmm.
getting hurt,
Right.
right? So we can't just assume that because we don't take this virus as serious or we don't take this pandemic as a serious thing that we're going to get, you know, we're going to get our stimulus check and we're going to be okay, because that might not be true. We don't know who's getting this money just yet. We just know
Right.
some ballpark numbers. We don't know. I don't know if I'm getting a check.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not even banging on that. If I get it, great. But if I'm planning on paying my taxes before July, that's all I'm worried
Yeah.
about. You know, like, and that's where we need to be, is like moving forward. But at the end of the day, as a collective of people, we always have to be able to protect ourselves no matter what. We have to be
Right.
planning to move forward. That's harder for some people than others due to family dynamics and
Mm-hmm.
situations. But as a collective, we always have to be thinking more proactive and not reactive. We are very resilient people. That's been
Mm-hmm.
one of our gifts
Mm-hmm.
as a collective, is being able to deal with trauma as it shows up in our lives. But
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the day, that resiliency should not be in spite of our ability to move forward. That resiliency should really be just a testament or a badge to our ability to thrive through the trauma, to thrive through the adversity as best as possible. And I think that as Americans, as
Mm-hmm.
people who live in the United States, we're gonna move beyond this.
Mm-hmm.
But what this looks like moving forward, I have no idea. And if it's any testament to how 9/11 was, or Hurricane Katrina, or any of these other national disasters, Black people didn't turn out too well after those things. And
Right.
that's my thing, that I'm trying to hope that we don't end up in a bad position or bad situation like we did in those two situations.
For sure. And I do want to go into some steps that you think that we could take. You kind of touched upon it already, so that we can start to move forward. How do we
Yeah.
begin to heal? Before we do that, wanted to kind of hop back into that. We touched upon it about epigenetics.
Yep.
So what is epigenetics and how does that fit into our conversation about the transfer of trauma?
Absolutely. So epigenetics is a big cycle. Social. It's a biological, psychological thing to think about. And in a nutshell, epigenetics is the crossover between your genetic makeup and your social lifestyle choices when they come together. It's the old adage of, is it nurture or is it nature that creates an individual? And what epigenetics gets at is the things that your parents, your grandparents, your great grandparents experienced genetically can influence the genetic makeup of you as an individual.
Okay.
One way we talk about it is through stress and stress hormones, but there are other things that can be passed on as well. But stress is important because what it ends up doing is changing that biological makeup of an individual, and you end up creating more of a tolerance for what's called cortisol. Cortisol is the main stress hormone. People who have high levels of cortisol end up having difficulties as they develop. So if you have a child who has high cortisol levels at the ages of, from birth, 1, 2, and 3, it's going to impact their social motor development, which means their speech, their ability to have speeches, their ability to learn, their ability to understand shapes and colors, and all these things will be impacted. One thing I hear from parents all the time about Black kids is that, oh, that little boy think he grown. He 3 years old, right? But he's around grown people all the time. Right. So socially, he might be able to pick up things and say words and do the new TikTok dance or whatever, but he might not be able to, in an academic setting, develop and move forward because of all the stress he's dealing with. So when he switches environments, he's at home doing TikTok dances, he's good. But when he gets in that classroom, or she gets in that classroom, and it's a calm environment, then the regulation becomes difficult due to the epigenetic situation, because this young person is dealing with so much stress. They're in this calm environment. Their cortisol levels don't need to respond in the same way. Their stimuli is very different, and they can't self-regulate in a classroom. And that's when you start to see young children with ADHD diagnosis or ODD diagnosis, these things that become problematic from a behavioral standpoint, when it's really just they're regulating differently in different situations. So epigenetics looks at the biological component and the social component as we move forward. There is a flip side to epigenetics, which is what Dr. Joy DeGruy talks about, which is this kind of behavioral and habitual thing that takes place in how we respond culturally to situations. So as Black people, epigenetics can be a big thing for us to think about, but really is how are we cultivating our children and ourselves in situations and understanding why do we act the way that we do? Some of it's biological, some of it is social.
I think that's great because Brendan, that shows that, yes, we could have inherited trauma.
Absolutely.
Right? But that doesn't mean that, oh God, I inherited trauma, I'm screwed.
Right. It doesn't. Not at all.
There is something that you can do about it. So, but is it, when you're going through your journey, your healing journey, right? Because as you said before, healing is a journey. No one can ever say that they have arrived. Like I am healed of all things that I have gone through, but it is a process. It is a journey. So in saying that, when you're looking at, how do you know if you've inherited trauma, or if you're trying to determine, did I inherit this, or is this something that I directly experience? Because if something is so normalized, like in your household or in your family,
right,
you may not know if it was passed on through your lineage. So then I may not know how exactly should I address it.
Yep. I would say the best practice for individuals is to assume that you inherited the trauma that you've experienced, okay? As Black people, and I'm going to say this one more time, our culture has been a response to adversity, which means that just the way that we act, the way that we have been named, the foods that we eat, the religions that we worship, all that has been a response to dealing with adversity, whether we call that adversity racism or white supremacy or whatever. If you are a Western Hemisphere Black person, Caribbean islands, Brazilian, African American person, a Canadian Black, you have experienced racism. Okay, you've experienced this adversity, and your culture has been developed to deal with that and address that. So yes, the trauma is there. But what's important is for us to understand that that adversity and that response hasn't 100% defined who we are. We've been able to still make beautiful, magical things out of us being Black. This is why we have what we call Black culture, Black girl magic, Black boy joy. All this stuff comes from who we are, and we've still been able to persevere through the face of adversity as best as possible. So we can't let that define us, but it is a part of us. So yes, we should assume that trauma is there. But again, that is just our historical collective trauma. There's also those interpersonal, family-related things that we always don't want to acknowledge or talk about, but it's very true. The reason why you live in the area that you live in. You know, I live in the state of Minnesota, and my family got here by escaping racism from the South and looking for economic opportunities, because my great-grandparents from my mother's side went to a place called Danville, Illinois, where that's where they met. They were both working. Once the jobs, kind of wrapped up there, they moved up to Minnesota. So they were looking for opportunity to keep moving forward. That's a part of my history. Yeah. And now my children are Minnesotans. They don't know what that means just yet. But as a Black person in Minnesota, there ain't a lot of us up here, as you can imagine. Like, people like, Black people live in Minnesota? It's like living in Montana. It's like, Black people live there? Yes, we do. Okay. They don't know that, because to them, it's just the normal thing. But there's a history that got them to where they are and who they are today, just like many of us. And that's very important for us to understand. So I would say, assuming that you have trauma in your history is important, because you do. If you're a Black person, you're experiencing trauma even when you don't know it. But also understanding your personal history is very, very important, because if you don't understand your personal history, you're missing a piece of who you are and how you are. And that doesn't mean you can't be great, you can't have success because you've had issues in your family. But what it does mean is you should understand those issues and deal with them as best as possible so they don't impact your life today.
Yeah. And so what's the first step someone could take with beginning to addressing?
Ooh, the first step is the hardest, right? Which is accepting the pain that you've experienced.
Wow. Yeah.
And sometimes it's hard to even acknowledge it, right? One of the biggest moments of my life was when I learned how to tell my mom no. I talk about this all the time. Like, when you tell mama no, like, that's a bad, like, you ain't supposed to tell your mom no in the Black community. You get your head cracked by everybody, right? But I remember when I was in college. I was a sophomore. I had 2 internships. I was working a job, and I was a full-time student living on campus. And actually, I was working 2 jobs. I was getting 2 checks. And I remember I would send my mom all my money. And I would just save like $60 for myself so I could get some gas and I could hang out with my friends on the weekends. And I remember, like, it was getting to the point where I was like, if I keep sending these checks to my mom, I ain't going to be able to have no fun in college. Like, my life is I'm trying to hang out with these girls. These girls want stuff. They want me to pay for Applebee's, and I ain't got the money. Like, I had to make a tough decision. And my tough decision was I had to tell my mom.
Or the
yeah, like, the girls was coming. And I was like, look, mama. I'm trying to go on 2 dates a day. Like, I'm trying to do a lunch and a dinner. Like, it ain't gonna work, baby. Like, so I had to have a conversation with my mom. Like, look, I can't keep giving you these checks. And I will never forget this phone conversation, because I was so nervous, because I knew in my head, I gotta tell her no, because it was coming, right? Payday was coming. And I said, look, mom, I'm gonna give you $80, but I can't give you the rest of this check. And the next check I get, I can't give it to you. I'm sorry. And she said, I understand, baby, you in college, you're trying to do the best as you can. I get it. And from that day, the dynamic between me and my mom shifted 100%. Wow. And we were already functioning like peers, because I left home. That's a whole nother story. We can talk about that at another time. Talk about intergenerational trauma. I left home early. But when I told her I can't give you my checks anymore, and I can only help you when I can, my mom stopped asking me for stuff. And I'm her oldest son. I'm the only one that went to college. I'm the one that they say I made it, quote unquote. Even though I think my brothers are doing a tremendous job, even though they haven't gone to college. But for my mom, I was really her first go-to for assistance and for help. But when I told her I can't do it because it was becoming too much, she understood that. And from that day, we always functioned like peers. I would say from the time I was about 16 years old till now, we've never had that traditional child-mother relationship. It's always been peers. So I always looked out for my younger brothers, and I've always helped my mom.
Mm-hmm.
And that was a big thing. Now, I had to admit that. I can't do this.
Mm-hmm.
Like, if I keep doing this, it's going to run me ragged, not just because I want to hang out with the ladies on campus, but also if I keep doing this, when does it stop? Right? Like, when does it doesn't stop?
Mm-hmm.
And now to the point where if my mom ever needs something, she always go through as many channels as possible before she comes to me. So I know when she needs something, I am the last bastion of hope. But now it's more of a conversation on how I can help versus a guarantee that I'm going to give you what I got.
Right.
That was a huge moment for me as a young Black man and as someone who relates to an adult. Because in the Black community, moms and Black women are the authority. I don't care what nobody says. And if you tell them no, it's a problem. Unless you got a Black father who is the head of a church or a deacon,
Right.
it's Black women at that point, right? And even then it gets a little fuzzy if we're going to be honest, right?
It's no fuzzy.
But it was such a like weight off my shoulders when I had to say, Mom, I can't keep doing this. Because if I keep doing this, I'm not going to be able to keep moving forward because I'm giving you I'm busting my butt all week and I don't have anything for me to progress as a student financially. And I need this. And she understood that. And, but that was a huge moment for myself. And I think that's a huge moment for many people is being aware and taking a step, what I call adaptive awareness. So you are aware of the situation, which many of us know stuff we shouldn't be doing. We know we shouldn't be dating that person that's toxic. We know we shouldn't be dealing with certain types of people or we shouldn't be working this job, but you have to adapt to that awareness. When you're able to do that, then you can get to the next two steps, which is the next one is balance and boundaries, right? So what's your balance with that? What are the boundaries you have? And then the last step that I call, this is my ABCs of awareness, of resiliency, sorry. The last step is consistent constructive choices. And you start doing things on a consistent basis that work out for you in the best possible situation. When you do that, then you start to see your life moving forward. I talk about all this stuff in the courses that I have. I talk about this in the audiobook that I have. And then I have a new video series that I'm going to be putting out here relatively shortly called Cultivating Calm During Times of Uncertainty. That's talking about this particular situation that we're going through.
That's awesome. And I look forward to watching that series for sure.
Absolutely.
Really quick, I just want to say when you had said, when you said accepting the pain, right, that first step. And I just wanted to say on my journey, this long healing journey.
Absolutely.
It's so true. When you do accept, like, okay, this happened, you know, especially I'm talking about during childhood, this happened, I accept it, understanding, not saying that it was right because I accepted it, but understanding that this has happened. And this is how I feel, because a lot of times we just kind of turn off emotionally, especially if the trauma continues. You can just kind of turn off and just become numb.
Right.
So now being able to feel it and saying it's okay that I feel it, going through that whole process. So that's what I went through. But I will say along the journey, and it took time for me to get to the point that I'm going to speak of now, I began to then not take it so personal as far as what happened to me during my childhood, because I began to see, as we talked about today, that a lot of the things that I went through with my parents, with aunts, with family, is because they had trauma that they didn't deal with.
Yep.
And it was so amazing, Brandon, because it took the weight and responsibility off of me feeling that I caused. For example, my parents got divorced when I was 16. And for years, I thought I had something to do with that. And it's amazing the what children place on themselves as being held responsible for what goes on in the household. So I say that to anyone who's listening. I'm not saying that happens immediately, because it didn't for me. I went through anger, guilt, shame. I went through a range of emotions while dealing with trauma. But then I finally got to the place where I said, okay, this is not even personal. Because then I began to see how how they treated other people. And I said, oh, there's a pattern here. So I just say that to anyone who's listening, like it once you start doing that work, and I'm not saying it's easy, but there is like this weight, at least for me, that was lifted, where I didn't feel the responsibility or whatever that was happening in my childhood, that I brought it on myself.
Absolutely. When you start to see your parents as human beings, when you start to see your siblings and your family members as people who are struggling, and when you understand that your trauma usually started before you were born, you free yourself from a lot of pain.
Mm-hmm.
And then you can start working on the things that have happened.
Right. So true. So true.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Brandon. I think that's like a perfect ending to our
Sure
episode,
thing.
what you just said. So, Brandon, thank you so much for joining today. If people want to get in contact with you, I know that you have the course
Mm-hmm.
on your website. If you could please
Yep.
speak to that, because I think that that would tie in perfectly. I know that we are going to talk about historical trauma in
Yeah.
a few episodes from now, but I think that that's great for people to take a look at now.
Absolutely. So I have 2 courses right now that are pretty much free. You don't have to pay for them. If you want to donate some funds to them, you absolutely can, but you don't have to. One is a 5-day video course called The Legacy of Trauma, which talks about how Black folks have gotten to where we are today from the transatlantic slave trade until now. And you'll get 5 days worth of videos. I do it kind of in presentation style, so you have nice, clear graphics. You can kind of see what I'm talking about as we go. And you can get that right now at jegna.org. That's JEGNA. So JEGNA, jegna.org. You can find that. You can sign up and subscribe for that 5-day video course. The new course that I have, because I've been getting flooded with Facebook Messenger videos, LinkedIn inboxes, emails, phone calls, people like, Brandon, what are we supposed to do now that we have this crazy coronavirus, COVID-19 situation? Like, what do you have to say about this?
Mm-hmm.
So the best thing that I could do is say, all right, let me just put together some information for people so they have something they can go to over and over and over and they can reference moving forward instead of me trying to respond to everybody individually. So what I created was cultivating calm during times of uncertainty, because I don't think that COVID-19 is the end of this. I think we're entering a new normal, just like we did after 9/11. I think that this is going to be something that we have to understand is dealing with pandemics, dealing with global crisis, and dealing with people in a new social element. So I put together another video course. It's probably not going to be 5 videos. It's actually going to be more like 4, but people will have access to that information and you can sign up. That also would be on my website. It goes live on April 6th. So April 6th is when everything goes live. So if you're watching this after April 6th, it will be there. If you're watching it before, you'll get it pretty soon. So cultivating calm during times of uncertainty. You can also find that at jegna.org. That's JEGNA.org. You can find that. Other content of mine you can find on YouTube. Just search Brandon Jones. You should be able to find me. If Brandon Jones Jegna, if you put that in the search, you can find me that way as well. Yeah, and you can reach me there. So
Awesome. And so I will put that information in description. Of course, this episode will be broadcast after, so that way it works out perfectly because people have access to the information. So that's awesome. Brandon, thank you so much for joining today. I really
thank you for
appreciate it.
having me.
I look forward to having you back again.
Absolutely.
So for everyone else, please, thank you for joining in today. Please visit my website, kaimarie.com, to find out more information about services provided. And please also go to my website so that you can sign up for the Journey to Healing newsletter that comes out bi-weekly. I promise I will not spam your inbox. So thank you all so much for joining me today and have a great one. Bye-bye.